All right, everyone, welcome back to Cheddar's News Wrap. People of color in this country experience discrimination in all facets of the American criminal justice system, and there is a huge racial disparity when it comes to marijuana possession arrests. Let's now go to Cheddar's own Chloe Aiello, who has more. Hey, Chloe.
Hey JD. It's 2020 now, and in 11 states across the US, any adult of legal age can walk into a retail shop and purchase cannabis. In 33 more states, cannabis is considered medicine. But in spite of these tremendous momentum toward legalization, not only of cannabis use, but also of its sale and taxation, enforcement of drug laws hasn't quite kept up. According to the ACLU, more than 500,000 Americans were arrested every year for cannabis related charges. In 2018, that number was closer to 700,000. And no, I'm not talking about major distribution or trafficking charges. 90% of these arrests are for possession. When you break it down by race, it paints an even starker picture. Black Americans are about 4 times as likely to be arrested for cannabis than those white Americans, according to the ACLU. And as you go deeper into the criminal justice system, you tend to see even grosser disparities. According to Last Prisoner Project, which is a nonprofit dedicated to redressing harms from cannabis criminalization, more than half of those cannabis convictions are among Black individuals, and 75% of incarcerated individuals for drug possession are Black. I spoke to Belaineh, Senior Policy Associate at Last Prisoner Project. They said these disparities are even more glaring when you look at the thriving commercial cannabis industry. Take a listen.
I mean, to put into context, just about every minute, it's actually less than a minute, just about 43 seconds, I think the most recent data says somebody is arrested for a marijuana offense. So that means despite widespread legalization, despite this billion-dollar industry booming and filling the pockets of, people that were already rich, to be honest, Black and brown folks are still continually locked up for things like marijuana possession. And sometimes people are locked up for things like technical violations on probation or parole for marijuana possession in states where it's actually legal.
Even arrests that don't end in conviction can seriously harm an individual's future prospects. But there's another more tragic outcome that we've heard quite a bit about in the news lately. As the recent protests over police brutality and over policing underscore, more run-ins between people of color and police tend to lead to more deaths. And cannabis is one major driver of law enforcement encounters. Take, for example, 26-year-old Breonna Taylor. She was shot in her home after police stormed in during a botched drug raid. On the horrific video of George Floyd's final moments, someone can clearly be heard saying, quote, "This is why you don't do drugs, kids." In still other cases, cannabis intoxication is used in what Natalie Papillon, executive director of the Equity org, called a post-mortem smear campaign. Of course, drugs are by no means the only reason for disproportionate policing and systemic racism. But Drug Policy Alliance's Maritza Perez said you really can't talk about one without the other. And if you know something about the genesis of cannabis criminalization in this country, that tends to make a lot more sense. Much of our current drug policy can be traced back to the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, one Harry Anslinger. A product of alcohol prohibition himself, Anslinger made no secret of his disdain for Mexican immigrants and Black Americans who were becoming at the time more visibly associated with drug use. Laws were designed to crack down on the drugs he framed as an alien threat, as well as on the people who use them. That legacy has continued throughout the decades. It reared its head once again during the 80s and 90s and the crack epidemic. Crack cocaine at the time was penalized more heavily than powdered cocaine, which of course had a heavier impact, as we now know, on African Americans. If there were any lingering doubts about forces underlying drug policy, a 1994 interview with Nixon aide John Ehrlichman put those to rest. He said, quote, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and Black people with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities." Attitudes have come a long way since in the 90 years since Anslinger was in charge of the Bureau of Narcotics, but Black and brown Americans are still suffering, even in states that have legalized and decriminalized cannabis. Take Illinois. In 2018, Black Americans were 7.5 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession, despite that medical cannabis had been legal there since about 2014, and the state was on the verge of legalizing adult use cannabis. And you can be sure that those people who have long suffered from drug policy are not now the ones who are profiting. Although marijuana business owners are predominantly white, there has been movement in some states and localities like Illinois, Massachusetts, parts of California to include minorities in the industry by lowering fees, granting free training, and prioritizing licenses. Many of those places I just mentioned also have begun introducing record expungement for people who have prior drug convictions. How helpful these tools actually are for people who have lived for a lifetime with these convictions and for people who are still in jail, however, is still up for debate. So in spite of overwhelming headwinds, there is hope. Advocates say that the mere fact that industry leaders and lawmakers from these jurisdictions all the way up to Congress are having tough conversations about equity, expungement, and legalization represents significant progress. Belaineh said they are hopeful. There is still time.
We're in a moment where I think it's indisputable that we've got things wrong as a country, and I think that sort of two worlds that I just laid out is just one manifestation of that. And the cannabis industry, because it's new, right? We're still moving from prohibition to legalization and decriminalization. We still have a chance to get this right, because whenever you're creating something new, we can reorient our intention and the goals and outcomes and how we're defining success.
As the U.S. leans into more progressive cannabis policies, advocates, lawmakers, and stakeholders predict rumblings of change in the way cannabis is bought, sold, and policed could have far-reaching consequences, not only for the cannabis industry, but for the criminal justice system more broadly. Back to you, JD.
Thanks a lot, Chloe. That's Cheddar's own Chloe Aiello, an outstanding piece of original reporting there. Thanks a lot, Chloe, for that perspective. All right, everyone, much more to come here on the News Wrap. Former Glee star Lea Michele is accused now of making